these hapless Europeans blown up on this rocky shore in December, I think it was, when they got there in November. And they're just overwhelmed by the lack of civility. And the passage then goes on to say, we are separated from all civil places by a great and roaring ocean. So I think in the American character, there's these two poles to keep in mind. That just do a very quick looking through different figures in American history. I think Benjamin Franklin, who came from a very large Puritan family in Boston. I think there was something like 35 or 40 siblings he had. And he was, of course, responsible for Poor Richard's Almanac, which was a kind of manual for farmers, with all these pithy sayings. And in the sense of, I don't think we could accuse Benjamin Franklin of being so much of a Puritan, that his own life and attitudes were something quite different. But there was an aspect of that Reformed tradition that he kept with him. And it shows up in the Almanac, in the Poor Richard's Almanac, and his sayings about early to bed, early to rise, makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. So there was this Puritan stream, this Reformed stream in his thinking and his life, which did prevail. I would say kind of a stream of Yankee thought. I look at our other speakers, one was known to, one was not, but I know Cyril is not necessarily. Are you from New England background?
I visited.
He visited long enough to pick up 2 degrees at MIT, so there's this wrestling with the Puritan heritage. I was saying these two poles we have of the savagery of creation on the one side and a sense of being good stewards on the other. How do we bring this forth? And of course, interesting characters like Franklin along the way, but also a very varied tradition in American history. I mean, I grew up with Yankee peddlers, grew up in Massachusetts and Connecticut, and the thrift, which was so important. I used to joke and say, well, the major agricultural product of New England farming was rock. All the stone walls everywhere, and very flinty kind of very hard-bitten old farmers hanging on. That was the tradition I knew and grew up in. And let's say there's this second thing of profligacy, which comes in the 19th century with the wiping out of the buffalo herds, the sense which is the extreme extent of the idea that you've got to subdue nature and get it under control. And of course, Teddy Roosevelt being the pioneer among, I guess, the most powerfully political pioneer among those, saying we've got to have a better balance about all of this. Now, just a quick figure. I got to know Ron Smith in the 70s when I was hired to become the first energy consumption analyst at the CIA. And at that time, the percentage of our oil that was imported was 25%. Today it's close to 2/3. And that's kind of a pretty sobering jump in just 30 years, 35 years of my professional life. And it's what we're going to do about this is some of the things we want to discuss, coming down, looking at first stating the problem and then trying to say, well, what are some of the solutions. I want to introduce, I guess, first of all, Ron Smith, who's been a friend for many years, trained at BU, as was I. Ron was the first branch chief for the Vietnam branch in the CIA, and in the early 70s, as the first great crunch came in 71, 72.
I think you mean energy branch.
It's at Vietnam.
Vietnam branch.
Oh, you meant
that's how you got started.
Yes, okay.
That's how you got started.
Yes.
And as that began, that particular struggle began to become backed down in the mid-70s. He asked to take over the energy branch in the mid-70s, which is where I met him. Ron then went on after some years to the Department of Energy and then on to Los Alamos National Laboratories. Cyril is known to all of us, but he just gave me his resume, and I didn't realize, after having worked with Cyril for many, many years, just how many credentials he had in this stuff himself. both a bachelor's and master's degrees at MIT, and working at what's running. I want to say Milwaukee Grumman. That's Northrop Grumman. Northrop Grumman.
One name from here.
Someday they'll all be together.
Okay. What I think I want to do is maybe pass it to you, and we'll have let's just have a discussion. I think we'll have I would say anyone can come in and ask questions as we go.
A comment about the history you just went through. There was actually a time when, from the state of Maine, where I'm from, there for two solid decades, the two largest exports were the products of quarries, rock, and the products of winter lakes, ice. And as you know, both of those products can be found all over the earth, having come from Maine. Their Maine granite is found not only in Washington D.C. but India.
Before that, wasn't it trees? And then they all got cut down.
We ran out of trees.
Oh,
Yes. Well, that's another. I think that tendency on the part of man has, and perhaps wasn't fully explored by the introductory material, but we're pretty good at just going through whatever God gives us.
Well, actually, historically, there's a whole branch, a sub-branch of that, which is the Royal Navy's search for topmasts.
Yes,
For sailing
Yeah,
ships.
right.
And they went, I think, originally to Scandinavia, and then they, of course, they wiped out England by the time of Henry VIII, and then went to Scandinavia, then to New England, masting the ships.
Not to stay off the track too long, but I live in Freeport, Maine, and below me there's a road called Mast Landing Road, Upper Mast Landing Road, and in another location there's Lower Mast Landing Road, and that depended upon from whether you were coming from the south or the north into the area, the Tidewater area in Freeport, where your masts were going to be loaded on ships. Enough of that. Excuse me.
You got
You want to take it?
Sure. I mean, you mentioned stones. The Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. And the question is, will the petroleum age end before we run out of petroleum? And the answer is probably yes. Ron has all kinds of books and knowledge, and so I can't, he'd probably do one for hours, so I'm not sure how you want to leave this. I'll cover a couple ideas and then turn it back to Ron to see what he'd like to cover. And what we'll do is we'll bounce back and forth. We heard from Howard about how the U.S. is changed in terms of energy that they maintain. I thought this was interesting. This is the impact of energy. In World War World War I, the United States controlled 70% of the world's oil production. And, we had U-boats, but basically we sent tankers there to support the Allies. And Lord Cruzen said the Allied cause floated to victory on a wave of oil. World War I. World War II. Obviously, Japan invaded Southeast Asia looking for oil. We put an oil embargo. Rommel, some people question exactly the nuance, but Rommel basically was going to North Africa and ran out of oil before he got to the oil to manage that. And Hitler invaded Russia in part to get the Caspian Sea for oil, so there's been political moves. Now, the U.S. controls less than 10% of the world's production, 70% to 10% from World War I to currently. And obviously you've seen in the politics of what's happening worldwide. So maybe in context, we'll cover a couple things just in today's international global. Then Jay's going to pick up what's happening in the United States, and then we'll talk about Paul and others about what's going to happen in Montgomery County, where they have some severely advanced regulations for energy usage and efficiency close to home and our homes in terms of for energy efficiency. But there's the general question of sustainability. So maybe a couple things I'll touch upon in the course of the day. First is the global view. Second would be a little bit on stewardships and what some of the groups and evangelicals have talked about. And then some of the individual technologies being looked at. But maybe I'll talk a little bit about international, global, and then turn it over to Ron. So the question would be, what happens, what's the international significance of energy? So there's a few scenarios I thought I'd do just to get your attention. This was a team of us that worked on a kind of a big picture story for GEIA, which is basically an organization that makes estimates of what's going to happen in federal government funding. And we try to look at what are big trends that are going to affect the U.S. and our relationship with the world. So think about these as potential scenarios. Asia-Pacific scenario. As you know, China has had a huge increase in energy production. The number of coal-fired power plants is really moving at a very quick rate. What happens if they decide that they want to go after the Spratlin and the Parcel Islands with military forces? Because it has oil, they want to expand that. They want enough energy. They're negotiating with Nigeria and other places for deals around the world. What happens if they decide that they want to use energy as a basis for expansion, and that, by the way, they're going to pick up Taiwan on the way? And what do we do? How does that affect the balance of power in the world when China, which is basically kind of an in the quarter, has done two choices? High polluting coal. They certainly can put in air pollution control systems, but they haven't had that desire. They've already done a lot of the hydro. But they have a kind of a quest for energy. How does that affect the world balance? Something to reflect on. Let's go in Eastern Europe. As you've heard from Russia, they have had kind of a trend to look at providing, being a major energy source. It's good for their economy, brings them a lot of money, but for importers of gas, the Baltic states, Finland, and Slovakia import 100% of their natural gas from Russia. They might be concerned about that spigot. Greece, Bulgaria, Czech Republic all have 80% or more of their natural gas from Russia. I don't have to tell you that there was a little bit of international furor when Russia decided to turn on the spigot, and that got people in Eastern Europe and Western Europe very concerned. What happens if they use that as a tool? Maybe it's not what happens if they use it more as a tool. How does that affect the balance of power of NATO when they're more concerned, they're making a judgment between fuel for their own citizens versus something else? So something to consider would be, what happens if Russia kind of moves into territories? And by the way, we brought some of this up earlier this year before Russia had moved into these territories, to try to annex Georgia and South Ossetia, and let's say Ukraine, Moldova, and Kazakhstan ask NATO for support, and we're trying to make a judgment: do we want to provide military support to make sure energy flows if Russia turns off the energy? Balance of power.
One comment on that. It's a good rundown. I noticed the other day, I just happened to read it in the Financial Times, that Lithuania, in addition to receiving all of its natural gas and all of its oil, for that matter, from Russia, also has one nuclear power plant with 3.5 million people. And this one large nuclear power plant, which is over against Belarus, produces all of their electricity, and it's a Soviet-era plant. It's been examined by Western scientists and engineers, and it works fine. But because of the anti-nuclear feeling in Europe, when Lithuania became a member of the European Union, they had to sign a deal that they would get rid of this nuclear power plant. And they have already, under that, I mean, this is a reality, this is a political, social reality that all of this is taking place in Europe. They have already closed down one of the two units, and the second unit is operating, and it's designed to be good for another 20 years. And again, Western scientists agree that this is fine. But they have this but I think it's just in 2012, it's very soon. They're supposed to close it down by their agreement with the European Union. And their only source of electricity then would be, again, Russia. So this is a very hot topic, even right now, because countries in the periphery there are facing these kinds of decisions.
I remember looking back when we had the energy crisis. There was war in there, and the basic idea then was this is going away. This is becoming obsolete. It's too dirty. And to counterbalance this black picture, look at France. France has this huge and successful, efficient and safe nuclear industry. And I don't know, I may be reading different stuff than you're reading, but I'm saying at least the Europeans are really looking at this and saying, here's the answer to the future. We've got to do something about our nuclear power anyway. And by the way, we talked about energy and say some of this energy we've got too much of. You say that coal, we've got a lot of coal, it's just very dirty. And say that what we don't have a lot of are the very precious liquid hydrocarbons. Gasoline, of course, the whole oil spectrum. So we talk about energy. That's a little, to my way of thinking, that's just too all-embracing. We don't have an energy crisis. America has a very positive domestic energy balance. We've got too much of the stuff we don't need so bad. What we don't have are the precious forms of fuel, liquid, stuff you buy at a gas station. So we've got these different kinds of issues, and I kind of feel it's helpful to kind of focus down and say, well, what is it that we really need? And we've got a lot of stuff that's kind of dirty, and it comes out of the ground, and we've got a history of, at one time, a great surplus. And Cyril was quoting these things about floating on a wave of oil. Well, Lord Curzon's statement, the United States floated on a tidal wave of its own oil during World War II. We were pumping stuff out of the ground and shipping it to Russia. We kept the British alive, we kept the Soviets alive in terms of their war machines based on the East Texas oil fields, which are gone.
Did you know that you were right about that, we didn't need rationing at all.
That's right.
But they did that to make people think so, because we didn't have rubber for tires.
That's right.
Because the Japanese had taken the various islands that produced our rubber at that time.
Indonesia. In fact, I remember my dad during World War II. I'm just barely old enough to remember this. And going to Saturday, and Dad's job during World War II at the B.F. Goodrich was in their synthetic rubber
That's right. I also
operation.
didn't want people driving at night, the lights, the whole thing, so it just
Right.
became a rationing item, and people bought into that because they were rationing everything else.
Well, what I wanted to point out, we've been throwing this around. Energy is just a very confusing concept to me because it's not energy. It's energy that is clean and that is abundant. And that's what we don't have a lot of. And Ron and I were kicking around all this week looking at this IEA thing that's just come out and said, and it just, hey, we still got all this stuff in the ground without a single reference to what it was going to cost to get it out of the ground. Because what the tragedy is, you got any resource exploration system, but common sense will say, what do you use first? The stuff that's standing on top of the ground. And that was literally true in Mexico in 1960 in Tampico. There's a foot of oil on top of those very primitive early fields. And what we now have to do, it's a question of, there's a lot of oil in the ground, but I think Ron was saying that only 30% of it can be gotten back again. So it's a question of a double problem. We're spending more and more money to get less and less. Yeah, sure. In terms of calories, there's a lot of hydrocarbons in the ground to run our fleets on. However, it's an exponential function of what that stuff is going to cost to get to a usable point. Well, I'll stop at this point. You want to pick up on that?
Yes. Well, another little comment on Europe and making its decisions now for the future, what its future balance is going to be. There is at least as much tension in Europe politically concerning the further use of nuclear power as there is here, and it's a major thing here, and it's going to become front burner one of these months, quite soon, I think. Excuse me.
Howard already indicated what he thought about nuclear. Would the two of you give your opinions on that, on the question of nuclear power? Whether we should go full steam ahead with nuclear?
Steam ahead, steam generators for nuclear power plants, yes.
Full steam ahead.
Yes, I actually, yes, I have some opinions.
And I do too.
And then you can decide how the opinions vary between us. A couple things. One, I decided to pull up Wikipedia. Now, what could be more generic than that? To set the stage for nuclear power. And in 2005, nuclear power accounted for 6% of the world's energy supply, and it accounted for 16% of the world's electrical production. There are, in November, which is 2007, which is still about current, about 439 operational nuclear power plants. We have about 120 or so in the United States. And so give you two examples of two country connections, and then turn it over to Ron for his perspective. He mentioned France. France has 80% or so of nuclear power. The company I happen to work for, Northrop Grumman, we just signed a deal last month with Ariba, which is one of the three major producers of nuclear power plants, to build a facility in Newport News, Virginia, to supply the steam generators and the large vessels in the United States, because they think there's going to be so much demand worldwide that they're not going to have enough sources of supplies. This is when I say they, I mean this is the leading manufacturers, of which there's three in the world, basically. Most of them have either deals with Japanese for production, and some of the large manufacturing facilities are just very limited in terms of what they can produce. So, yes, they're the major in the United States. First point is, a lot of the nuclear power plants have had their life extensions, their efficiency has gone up, basically from about 80% or so to the high to 94% or so. Substantive increase in effectiveness, online capability. They've had life extensions, so they've added, the NRC has extended their lives for 20 or more years, it depends. And so the life is going long. There's new plants coming online, or at least being designed, and I'm not sure what the current count is, 15 or 20 or so that have put in for license applications. They've changed the licensing structure. So it used to be you got a license to build it, and then once you're finished, then you have to get a license to operate it. And as John might think about in Russia, it's a problem when you spend all your money up front and then you have to get an occupancy permit to get your facility used. It's a problem if you spend billions of dollars and then some intervener groups don't let you operate it for years. That's a problem, economic problem. They kind of address that by having a common licensing to do both. So in the worldwide, it's substantive. I give you data. In the United States, it's I think it's going to grow again. So let's go to another country. Germany. Germany was pitching to some people downtown about how they're doing their support for renewable energy. So they were basically have a very interesting process where they basically look at what the break-even cost would be for wind and solar, and then they give a subsidy to people for 20 years that would basically balance it out, so it makes it cost-effective to put in these facilities versus something else. And the pricing is, it takes a government authority to do this, because they get different subsidies according to the fuel, not to reach parity in terms of what people, for diversity, but they have more subsidies for one versus the other. So if you're less efficient, you get a higher subsidy in terms of energy production. So they went through their whole spiel about why this was good, and then somebody in the back would say, hey, I thought you were phasing out your nuclear power. How's the amount of energy you're going to produce by all this renewable energy balance to getting rid of the nuclear power? Oh, it's about the same. And so the problem, what they were on the path for getting rid of nuclear power and replacing it with renewable energy with a huge amount of subsidies, because of the Green Party. They're now having second thoughts on that, but it shows the political tensions in different countries. Of course, Germany and France, as you might know, are slightly close to each other, but they have extremely different policies regarding nuclear power. So those are two vignettes for countries. But Ron, what would you like to add?
Yes.
You didn't answer the question.
Oh, which one? What
I
I
asked
think?
you what your view on that was.
I think it's going to happen.
No, do you think it should? I'm interested in it
Oh, well, yes.
as a moral issue, actually. I think there is a moral issue involved in that.
Okay, well, now we're going to move. Okay, I knew we were going to get the chance to talk about morals and sustainability. And I think it is a question that a couple aspects to it. First is, how much do we kind of use more resources than we need. Back in the Depression, people were very careful with resources in general. They would save things and recycle things. The amount of stuff we recycle is very low, and so there's a whole question of sustainability in resources in general. In energy, it also applies in terms of efficiency, being, I think, the most important thing to do. As to the moral things of nuclear power, the question is, in terms of the nuclear power production itself, it's good in the sense that it doesn't, the number of people and deaths that have occurred from nuclear power, set aside terrorism, we'll get to that in a second, has been very low. The number of people killed in coal mining accidents, in petroleum problems, in production is vastly higher than the amount of people killed in operating of nuclear power plants or in uranium mining. So in terms of the safety, it's a much more moral system to use for nuclear power than others in terms of deaths.
Except that people make mistakes. I mean, overall, yes, it looks like it's safe, but people are fallible and they make mistakes. And the worry to me is the potential for a really disastrous mistake is so much greater with nuclear than it is with anything else. Is it right to take that kind of risk?
Well, so the question is, there's some of the scientists that were developing the nuclear power at first had those kinds of qualms you did when there was nuclear power with atomic bombs. And there was a lot of travail and angst about some of those scientists, which is what they've written, about the impact of nuclear power as a weapon. And that is still with us. And there was the balance for a while that it was the whole strategy of the country to make it so scary for the ICBM system for the Russians that neither lucid leader would use them because they were so damn dangerous. But they're now being produced. There's designs out there. We're concerned about radioactive, the dirty bomb story, but the technology is out there. And if you move from the big gaseous diffusion plants to some of the more advanced, laser technology, you can do it in a much smaller space and it's harder to track. So the moral hazard of exposing the world to this technology has occurred. The second question is, do you exacerbate that by making it more prevalent by having nuclear power plants throughout the world? We don't have a tight regime on the reprocessing and basically control the materials, so everything comes out and comes back at night. Sorry for this vignette. There's a company called Explo in New York City who had the responsibility for tracking all the explosives in New York City because people were concerned that the various mobs and gangs would use explosives to blow people up. That was considered to be a bad thing. But blowing up rock for buildings was a good thing. And so Explo every day would take the explosives out to the construction sites and bring them back at night so there was no explosives left on any of the construction sites in New York City. If you did the same thing with nuclear power and you controlled the radioactive materials from the research reactors, which the United States would be gathering up because they don't want to have them around, and you did all that reprocessing in carefully controlled situations, you would get around that. You'd have that safety, but that's not occurring. And so therefore, there is an increased risk of having nuclear power plants around because you're using more highly enriched uranium. But as I told you, there's already 439 plants in lots of different countries. And so the risk of this nuclear material is already out there. Do you exacerbate it if you double the number of plants? Yes. If you're building a number of plants and basically reactor number 4, 5, and 6 at the same location, the control systems are about the same. The risks are probably that much higher. It's when you put them in other parts of the world when Iran starts using them. So the second question is there a higher risk? Yes. Is there a moral change? I think not, because the line has already been crossed. The third answer to the question would be, what's the role of people doing scary things to others? Read that as terrorists using nuclear reactors or nuclear material to blow people up or cause a problem. The same issue, and I think the answer is human nature is such that people are willing to do that. You don't have to look further than Mumbai, which is a hotel I stayed at with my wife a year and a half ago for in Mumbai, the Taj, that got blown up with people killed, 100 Americans down. Will people try to kill other people? The answer is yes. Will people do that with biological material, which is very easy to manufacture? Yes. That's a long answer to your question that in some ways the nuclear genie is out of the bottle. Destroying the nuclear waste for a long time, I don't think is an issue. So let me pause there and see what Jay would like to add.
Well, I think too in this thing you get a trade-off of moral issues on this thing, because the main reason you would probably see a big push on nuclear energy is for climate change purposes, and that's why European countries are starting to rethink this kind of thing. And the moral issues in climate change are just abound. I mean they so overwhelm the moral issues that you can probably come up with in terms of, number of people affected, intergenerational issues, that sort of thing. That if it does turn out that nuclear, in fact, is going to be a key component, albeit maybe it's a midterm, it's a this century only kind of component, and trying to get some kind of brakes on the amount of greenhouse gases accumulating in the atmosphere, then you probably argue, yeah, nuclear does add an element of risk, but the other possibility is way scarier. At least that's sort of what people are thinking now.
Just to support those last statements, if you look at the task, which, and I was just reading a piece here the other day, put out by a group called doesn't give them a name. A group of large financial institutional investors in the rich countries have gotten together and told governments, and this is these are a group of 130 very large companies. They're movers and shakers in the business world, and told the governments of their host countries, the rich countries, that the emissions from fossil fuels should be cut by 95% over the next 45 years, something like that. Well, that's a staggering task. It's even if we do everything that my green friends, and I call them my green friends because I know all these people in the environmental movement and all this, and I share their desire to do much more with wind and solar and much more with saving. And I expect to see a lot of these things in the president's new budget. There's still no way that we can do this thing without nuclear power. We have right now 22% of our electricity in this, just for this country. I could say the same thing about Germany. It comes from these aging but well-operating nuclear power plants. Almost all the rest of it is fossil fuel, and a little 1 or 2% that we're getting now from wind and solar. We can't do that fast enough, and even if we could do it faster, we still need another source of electricity to keep the whole system going, because of the variability of both wind and solar. You've read about all that. They're great sources of energy, but they need a base load system from some other source to make the system work properly.
Electricity is basically produced during the day, and you want it at night. And the real problem is, I look at electricity and say, well, this is basically a form of transmitting energy that is all there in the day, and where do you store it long enough to keep it viable during the night to heat and bring light? And say that the other side of it is there's a lot of hope in the sense, you've heard the expression, America is the Saudi Arabia of wind power. That's probably true with T-Bone Pickens and these other guys talking about that. But the problem is, how do you store it? And say that this is the great advantage of something like gasoline. You've got a bomb there. It's nothing more compact or convenient than the kind of energy you've got in a gas tank. But you think of all this noise about electric cars, which I've been reading about for 35 years. You got this delightful new thing. It's expensive to begin with, and you've got to spend $6,000 in about 5 years' time to put batteries back that have to be reconstituted and put back in as new. The battery technology, as far as I know, has not really leaped ahead with great efficiency. Since the days at the beginning of the century, you had, in a town like Springfield, Illinois, where I used to live, there was a charging station, and the ladies would bring in their electric cars because they couldn't crank them. Wealthy ladies had electric cars, but there's not been this great breakthrough in electric power of that type with any great efficiency since that time. So you've got different kinds of energy, different flavors of energy.
Well, you mentioned electric cars. Thing that's not often mentioned is that the electricity to charge the batteries in an electric car is generated by burning coal.
That's right.
80%, as you say,
Yeah.
which is adding the things we don't want.
And it's a trick. It's a country. You've got this dirty power source
In terms
producing.
of cleaning up the atmosphere, electric cars don't do it at this point.
Unless you can find some other clean way to produce it, but as far as I know, with the exception of wind power, which is the new thing that is coming in. But again,
Someday, yeah.
with that, and if you were to run, I spent a lot more time in recent years looking at it than I do, but how do you store all of that nice electric power? And it used to be, I think when you're dealing with water, you could pump water into a reservoir. Back in the old days when you had water-driven generators and power plants, they had pumps that would put this stuff up in a reservoir tank, and you'd open the gates for those guys for that peak of demand in a winter night.
I don't think any of those have ever proven cost-effective.
Well,
They
essentially,
built a big one up in Michigan and
Right.
operated for a few years, and now it stands there.
well, I want to come back, and Ron's done a lot of work on wind, so I want him to come back. Yeah.
I think when we talk about petroleum and stuff, as a chemist, I think we need to remember petroleum is a major feedstock for the whole chemical industry. If you're wearing nylon, if you're wearing any of those fibers, they usually start with oil.
Plastics are at risk.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Secondly, I guess one piece of information that I don't think we've laid out is how do we spend our energy? I think the majority, the biggest hunk is heating and cooling our houses and buildings.
I'd say transport.
And then
This is what I've seen.
transport anyway in there. So we can do some things, but I look at transport and I say we're not going to the power that it takes, or the driving force that it takes to change at least our commuting system starts with planning and zoning, which is a very, very local thing, you know. And so you've got that issue. I guess part of the thing that I come back to on this whole energy, cut to the chase, is I do not see how we can continue to maintain the current lifestyle that exists in this country and do any of these major energy changes that we're talking about.
Okay, I would say something like, if you look at an American city in, say, 1910, and I live in Falls Church, and Falls Church originally was strung out along this railroad line that's now gone, and this was poor farmland. Northern Virginia wasn't the rock that it had in New England, but it's not good for growing anything. And it was the rail line that came out. I think we're probably going to go back into that. I think probably right now that micro decisions are being made where people are moving out of far suburbs, exurbs, and moving back in. There's a hand over here.
How real is wind energy in urban areas?
Well, it doesn't make any sense. The great area, Ron, am I cutting it on your turn?
No, absolutely not. I didn't quite hear the question.
How real answer is wind energy for urban areas?
I think it's more you put something on your house.
This is what I was alluding to before when I was elaborating someone else's comment. one of the, to answer the question is, it's very real if you're not too far away. But physics doesn't change, and we have to either convert that wind created electricity into something else, or move it to a place where it can be used. And this is one of the reasons why you need base load of some kind to service the places where the wind is not going to go. The same kind of question obtains with solar, which in my view will eventually be a bigger piece of the pie than wind, because for all kinds of reasons. One, I think its costs are going to go down faster. But wind is not suitable for all areas of the world or all areas of any given country.
Well, in
You're
terms
right.
of quantities, say the Washington area, what percentage of our energy could feasibly be generated by wind power?
Well, if you look at I've seen the map, and Ron and I have been digging through stuff all week long on this, and there's a map, there's a very red blob on the Great Plains. That is, this is why the U.S. is called the Saudi Arabia of wind power. And there are these steady winds, say, from the Dakotas going down to West Texas. And that's where the big wind farms are. And that's going to be increasingly a factor that comes in. But again, as I understand it, and Ron, you guys can correct me here, but the problem, I think, is the old one about how do you store what is essentially a lot of electric power at a time you can't immediately use it.
Well, 2 or 3 organizations over the last decade have tried to estimate, what share of American electricity might come from wind, and they all come out with at maximum around 20%, and it's for all the reasons you're discussing. It's a very valuable source of electricity, but it's just not, it has a role, but not the whole role. It can't do everything. Sir.
This is both comments and an advertisement for next week, but
we'll save it for you.
I'm going to take on a small set of issues next week on domestic. One of them is going to be the Pickens energy plan. So I'm going to talk about both wind and natural gas. Try to put in perspective what we're really up against in that. But I think in the wind, the answer is if you want to start to get toward 20% for starters, you're going to have to reinvent the transmission system in the United States to move that stuff around. And it's going to look like nothing like it looks like now. And it's going to be, probably fighting every mile of that system, put in these high voltage lines. So it's going to be a challenge. It's one of those things that theoretically is possible. But we're going to have to change the whole way we think about it.
So you're agreeing 20% is a very high side figure?
I think 20% is probably, at least from what we know now, is kind of an optimistic maximum.
Right.
Yeah.
Agreed. And then there since we're dealing with decisions made by human beings, for some reason, you may recall that someone on Cape Cod decided to object to a wind farm that was planned for offshore because they could see it, and they didn't want to see it, which has caused people all up and down the East Coast to say, no, we can't have it because we don't want to see it. So even though we have some of the best wind, concentrated wind, is along the Maine coast, incredibly good winds, and that's where we should put the first wind farms in the east. And I see this coast every day. I live in it, but I've also traveled in 3 different countries over the last 2 years and seen how they site their wind power. None of them, the Netherlands, Germany, and Spain, I was particularly struck in Spain, where in what do we call it? In zones along the coast where people come and bathe and otherwise have fun, you can see the windmills everywhere. Nobody seems to notice them or object to them. Yet we've decided that, and the way we zone things locally, as someone was talking about, we're not going to have wind power where you can see it. So unless you want to go out on the Atlantic Bight, which is a shallow place offshore, people now are talking about having a gigantic wind farm dotted with wind farms out there because they're far enough away not to be seen from the shore. Well, maybe we'll do that, but it certainly adds to cost, which is a point that you are making.
But Spain also does the hilltops.
Yes, the hilltops.
And then they farms down in the valleys,
Right.
solar belts.
Yeah, yes.
It's right along there with the...
I was emphasizing that this is kind of a psychological block thing for us. We've decided we don't want to see them.
I wouldn't mind one on my roof. Either one of them.
Do you see the sun enough?
If they're not going above me.
Is there enough sun in Maine? I mean, is it that?
I think there's enough sun everywhere. We could have, we could have a solar thing on our roofs right now.
Well, you probably will have, because we're going to,
Get rid of the
we're
TV
going
antennas
to,
and stick up the wind thing and,
not to scoop anybody else's future, but people are quite taken with the idea of generating electricity from both solar and wind, and I think we're going to continue with that. It's just a matter of what kind of a role it can reasonably play in the out years as we try to deal with a much larger problem, which is global warming. Excuse me.
Just a comment and a question. My comment is that necessity really is the mother of invention. And I don't think we should overlook what this crisis, or bordering on a crisis, might bring about by way of innovation.
Right.
The question is, I haven't heard much about natural gas. Could you explain a little further the trade-offs with respect to natural gas?
I'm not against the Pickens natural gas use on the grounds that it can play a role in backing out liquid fuels in the near term or the intermediate term. But I really would rather have someone with more technical background than I give give the answer. I mean, Pickens he does take care of the problem that you can't have a filling station for natural gas on every corner by suggesting that most of it be used by fleets of trucks, and that's the way it's being used now, basically. But I'd rather have somebody else get on this answer.
I can talk to that a little bit. I have a friend who's been working for a number of years on CNG, compressed natural gas. And what he is looking at right now is putting together some sort of program of buying property or compressed natural gas for vehicles on street corners, around, thinking that when there's no more petroleum available, there's a lot of natural gas, and it's kind of a renewable energy too. With our disposal of organic matter and cows and so forth. The issue is with distribution. There's getting the natural gas from someplace where it is to these corner stations. And what he's looking at is taking it from a natural gas pipeline that's already available and moving it a short distance, tapping into these natural gas pipelines, which is and compressing it, and then selling it on retail for automobiles. And the technology is there. There's a lot of cars around now that can operate on compressed natural gas.
Okay, I'd like to change the tenor of the conversation for a moment. We talked a little bit about energy. I'd like to raise moral issues because it's a wrestler's class, and we know you'll hear technical judgments. And today we're talking about kind of international, big picture issues. Next week, we'll probably hear a little bit more about some of the technologies. A lot of what happens when you do to save things tend to be efficiency, and that tends to be local. But let's move it back up to some of the big pictures. 3 points to make. A moral question. What is the responsibility and rights of developing countries to get energy? There's a very clear correlation between GNP and energy usage. Countries that China and India and others are saying, look, you the Western countries already use, you're almost profligate in terms of use of energy. what happens, why don't we get the same amount? Why can't we burn coal in China? Maybe it's pollution, maybe it increases global warming, but, we have the right to have the energy use. Some of the early things happened in Texas and kind of the crazy places that people, developed oil. It's now our turn. So there's a moral question, which sometimes balances out this climate change question. So that's the first point. I'll come back to that. The second one is, what's the economics of energy production? Hugo Chavez in Venezuela has used it as a tool to basically keep himself in power. You look at the House of Saud and how they've used oil and the development that's occurred. You look at Nigeria and how the people that have the power have kept the money, and some of the people that are nearby are basically struggling and creating problems because they don't get any money. It happens even in Ecuador, where I've seen where the government kept it and the people, the poor tribal people, didn't get any money. And so there's kind of an inequity of how the money from petroleum, it tends to be petroleum because as much solar tends to be distributed and changes the game a little bit because it's a more distributed use. Certainly agricultural usage and anaerobic digestion tend to be local. But the big dollar generators in the past have been petroleum. Nuclear, because of people's concerns over it, have been fairly regulated. But oil's been pretty open. So what's the moral responsibility for consumers, which basically is pretty low, about worrying about the inequities of the people generating the money from producing oil? Most people have looked the other way and said, well, they're the people in power. We'd rather have oil for ourselves. We're not going to be, as long as it's a free floating price for oil and everybody gets to play, and actually the ability of the various producers to regulate that price of oil is limited. But the second moral question, I basically want to turn back to you to talk about, is what about the inequities of how money is generated and kept by people producing energy? A worldwide moral question. Third one, creation care. It's sustainability. It's, do we have the right to use this much energy and materials? Does the world, can they sustain it? Is it good for us? Not just can we keep doing it, but is it a moral right thing to do that's appropriate? I don't know whether some of you heard Richard Cizik, who was here at this class. He is vice president at the National Association of Evangelicals, not what you think of as basically an energy group. And they basically, he personally has done a lot for energy creation care. Back in November of 2007, this again is a local issue, they had to push on all the churches to reduce 10% of their energy use. This is a local question rather than a national question. But they are looking at the responsibilities of a Christian for creation care, for what God has created in our world. And he's, when they met with Gordon Brown, the Prime Minister, he said the evangelicals are, what they're doing on climate change is critical. The evangelical movement, that group, that John Chico, by the way, was selected as one of the 100 most influential people in the world in 2008. That only based on Times list. And that's a caliber of our speakers, so not for us, but for other people. So the third moral question is creation care. What responsibilities do we as Christians have to be efficient? So I'd like to toss that open to the group for people's reactions, or you, to those moral issues. So maybe
this fascinates me because I seldom am in this kind of a venue. These are the questions, and I'm remembering a quote in something that I read 2 days ago, in which a person referred to the power, a gallon of gasoline as being equivalent to crack cocaine. And it's in this context. This is such an incredibly pure, clean, useful thing, and in a moral, looking at it from a moral point of view, the bulk of it that we're producing right now is being frittered away. It's a personal judgment, and usually we're stuck talking in technical and market terms, and we don't get to talk about what you're bringing up, and it's crucially important. I think there's a huge role for thinking about this for our entire society. It is a way out of a lot of dilemmas. But we live in a world in which everything is done in a political arena. We created this little energy analytical group that I headed for the first decade or more at CIA. This is not in the overseas guys. This is the think tank end. And I watched, because I was a resource for each one of them, I watched presidents, starting with Jimmy Carter all the way through, tell the working analytical community, don't tell me I have to have a gasoline tax. And so we never had a gasoline tax. We never did anything to suppress the use of gasoline in the United States. We just begged, borrowed, and steal, and you know what I mean by both of those. Our president goes to places like China and Saudi Arabia and begs. So there is a great moral component, and that's where I come out on it. I think we need to find ways of more judiciously using energy, and it's at a crisis level. Answer. That's your answer.
Well, it seems to me that the church has fallen way down on its responsibility here in terms of individual acts and the church institutionally. And Richard Cizik and the evangelicals, they're showing the way. But our tradition is a prophetic tradition. Look at the Old Testament. Those prophets were speaking to all the stuff that the people were doing wrong in their lives, in their society, in their states. I don't understand why 1 out of every 4 sermons here in this church is not a prophetic sermon about these issues that we're talking about and about what we can do to deal with this crisis. I mean, John said that this will produce innovation, but it hasn't. It hasn't produced innovation because of what you're talking about. People are so selfish and want to go on and do things the way they've always done them. And we need prophetic words, and we need to look at the Old Testament and think in prophetic terms about our own responsibilities for this.
And historically, what I remember growing up in the 60s, when the whole black civil rights thing was going on. And there was Gordon College, which is this sterling example of an evangelical school. And you never heard about this stuff there. Or something like 6 black kids on campus from Boston. And I'm saying that you look, and I frequently said in this room, God speaks from the periphery. But I think the other side of it is that the established churches, of which we're a part, have not led that. At least I say, all right, now there are 30-odd people in this room talking about this and thinking about this stuff very seriously. So we have come a long way from when I stumbled onto this stuff in the beginning, or the end of the 70s. So we're looking at this, and I don't know what the answer is, but at least we are concerned and we are really seriously trying to look at it. But where do you expect prophetic utilization to occur, to coin the phrase? Do you have a demonstration project here? Do you get the young people of this congregation involved in this stuff? I don't know. But that's about it.
One little quote to bring this back, referring, in times of moral decline, there's always more talk about rights than duties.
But I think we're past that right now, Paul. I mean, Jimmy Carter was a nuclear engineer as well as a Southern Baptist, and what I remember, and Ron can back me up or correct me on this, I think he had the right ideas. 2 things happened, is that you've got the Bubbas, and the Bubbas got big cars, and what we decided to do in this country was 2 things. One, you basically freeze and keep low as you can the gasoline price so these guys can go to the work. Because these guys are living on the edge, and they are the ones who are really suffering right now in terms of what's happening.
It was Jimmy Carter who put the solar panels on the White House and Reagan who took them off.
Correct.
And that was the beginning of the end of solar development.
I think it was a one battle in that was lost.
Actually,
But we could have kept, we would all have one now.
But you're saying essentially symbolic, because the solar panel technology at that time was not very good. That was really big
Nothing
productivity.
much been done with it. But think if we had done something with it all these years.
As a symbol.
Yeah.
It's not just a symbol, it's leadership.
That's
I
right.
mean, leadership is what is necessary.
That's right.
There are good people, good Christians who just don't see things. And that's why I gave the example of civil rights, which is also part of the burden we bear. That we did, it was not the evangelicals who led civil
College,
rights.
and it didn't come to the administration, but the students marched and wound up in jail in some cases. These are Southern girls. Now, maybe it wasn't the Southern girls who did the marching and wound up in jail, but nonetheless, this came from the college, the student body, not from the administration.
There was a hand back there.
Coming back to Cyril's moral dilemma, if you will, of the accumulation and distribution of wealth, we have to go back into biblical times. Solomon's wealth was beyond all belief. He was the son of David, God's beloved. Solomon comes through as being one of the good figures in biblical history. So I'm not sure that that is a new dilemma, first of all. And I'm not sure where, if we want to look for biblical guidance, we can really resolve that moral dilemma, because we do have so many examples of the accumulation of wealth, the accumulation of power, and a close association therewith with working out of God's will. So I'm not pronouncing, I'm just saying that I think it is something that is less, the instinct of all of us in the room probably is to say it's unjust to have that sort of phenomenon going on. And yet, it's not quite that clear, I don't think, if we look to the roots of our religious beliefs.
Yes, it is. You have to look at Jesus. Jesus is the Lord of the Scriptures. It's pretty clear when you look at what he said he did.
Well, he said, sell all you've got and distribute it to the poor and follow me. Yeah, that's true when he speaks to the rich young man, the rich young ruler. At the same time, you do have the Old Testament examples, and even some of the New Testament examples. If you go to the parables of the masters of the vineyard and so on and so forth, the people who say 10 talents, go and invest them so that I can become richer. That's one of the stories, one of the parables. Be a good and faithful steward of my wealth. Isn't that part of that parable?
Yeah, but that's not about accumulating wealth. That's about being willing to take risks with what you have.
But it's, but I
The
think
point
you
is
do
not
get into
to
the
accumulate
accumulation.
wealth.
It's the accumulation of wealth may not be the ultimate end, but it is at the base of what the master is doing.
But it wasn't Jesus' point in telling that story.
Can I quote, just throw a couple numbers here. Americans are 5% of the world population. We use 25% of the world's energy. And I don't have any trouble with that. The question is, there was something said earlier in the session that indicated, hey, all these poor, struggling third world peoples don't have this stuff. Well, I think they might be happier than we are. And if you live in Brazil, you don't have to cope with the winter that much. So you have the best ethanol in the world. In fact, there's a whole subsidiary thing with all this Brazilian ethanol around we could get if we got rid of the import duty.
Yeah, we're going to have to close off soon. I just want to ask you one question on a kind of a positive note. You've probably heard the phrase, what would Jesus do? There's another phrase, what would Croesus do? Now King Croesus, of course, was the legendary king of ancient history, right? And he had unlimited wealth, right? He had power and whatever. He could do what he wanted. Given that you were, suppose you're King Croesus, what would you do? What would be your vision of the way the world will look energy-wise 100 years from now? Or maybe 200 years from now, what will it look like in terms of a sustainable world in the future? What kind of scenario would it look like?
I'm very pessimistic. I mean, I guess I read too much science fiction as a kid. I can see terrible things happening. I don't see a great golden future. The kind of thievery, which is the national product
We have
of
to have a
Nigeria.
positive goal. We have to have some vision, or the people will perish. So what's your vision for the future?
Yeah, but that's within the context of the covenant of Israel and God speaking to his people, and we've got to face up to the fact that there are even a lot of Americans who are unregenerate people.
Sure.
You're dealing with a sinful
Given
world.
all that, I'm
And
saying, what's your strategy? What's your vision?
Good question.
Well, if you look, particularly 200 years ago, they didn't have petroleum. The Bible reference was referring to oil, referring to oil plants. And so therefore, if you look 200 years in the future, you could perceive a new technology, the fusion types of issues. I would think by then you need to move to something sustainable. So the increased projections in silicon and amorphous silicon, I suggest you're going to have fairly effective solar collectors nearby. Wind, I think, will probably be used. Basically, you're going to use stuff that gets going to be generated. The trade-off between food and energy will be, I'm not sure there's going to be this big ethanol. It's not very efficient and effective. Some of this, there may be selective grains grown in places like Brazil. But then again, you have to maintain the land and if you keep growing the same crops. So I believe it's going to be a distributed group of power. I believe that there will be, if the world doesn't destroy itself, I think there will probably end up being long-term nuclear power and breeder reactors and recycling. But you've got to look to the solar as a long-term source. The petrochemical industry is much more valuable use of those materials than for burning it. That's an incredible waste. I can't believe they keep doing that. We keep doing that for 1,500 years. People build recycling and systems in. They'll make these systems are being put in, and new environments have much more recycling in terms of building. A major issue is building codes, because buildings stay in place for like 20, 30 years. When you build, if you build, let's say, an aircraft, that's in service for 30 years. It takes a long time to swap that out. 10 years for a car. You have the ability to build in much more efficient devices, and so that's bound to occur in 50 years.
But when people buy them, if you look at this whole crazy thing about the SUVs, and how could this have happened? The idea was to back out of cars and everybody bought trucks. So you're dealing with the perverse incentives of consumer society.
Because we didn't tax them like cars.
Like they do
I'm
in
not
Europe.
speaking of myself personally, but I know plenty of wealthy people who went out and bought SUVs like that because they weren't taxed.
Well, because they didn't have the high price, they were not passenger vehicles.
Didn't the government give incentives for buying SUVs?
Yes, that's what I'm
years
saying.
ago?
Yeah, reverse
I think our
incentive.
big hope was when we had gas at the pump at $4 a gallon. That somehow there's a moral incentive for saving gasoline.
And people are concerned about new energy development because the price is dropping.
One last comment, since it's a hot ticket item right now. We can't blame those poor fellows who run the car companies for this whole thing. We created them.
Yeah, right. We have met the enemy and he is us.
Just one thing, we do have some books here, should you want to come up and look, and Paul, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you all, and let's close in a word of prayer. Lord, we thank you for your presence among us here as we are wrestling with major issues. We pray that you'll guide us in how we can apply this to our own situation. And we thank you for our speakers, for their leadership and their wisdom, and we pray that you'll guide us through the next week and through this series to apply this to our lives. Thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you all. Come back next week for Dr. Brach.